Hello, today continuing with the kind of industrial hobbit hole, rabbit warren type setting. Very whimsical, kind of Moonstone-esque. And I'm going to make a large blast furnace that's kind of been built into a hill. To begin with, made a template out of foam core, then started creating some bricks out of styrofoam, using a tinfoil bowl to put some stone texture on. Then using matte Mod Podge to build up the large kind of refiner. Starting with larger bricks at the bottom, and working up to smaller and smaller ones. Then to create some facades for the housing, took another piece of foam core and some balsa wood beams, trimming them down so they look a bit more natural. Then using matte Mod Podge to glue them down and filling in the gaps with more pieces of styrofoam. For the door, I took a piece of a sheet of balsa wood and scored some lines in, rather than try and make it out of individual planks. For the base of the blast furnace, I took another piece of styrofoam and then trimmed some channels into the front, so that the processed metal could run into these channels and create some ingots. Now, this might not technically be correct, having the channels carved out of stone as opposed to sand, and this is not meant to be a 100% accurate reproduction of a blast furnace. To build up the hill, I took polystyrene and used hot glue to place it down. Then using hot glue again to glue the rest of the pieces into place. I find a lot of the time that using less hot glue is better, as it avoids potential warping on the base, especially with larger components like the base of the blast furnace. With the pre-built sections now in place, I added a few more bits of polystyrene to fill in the gaps where the hill didn't quite meet the facade. For the next step, I took a mixture of water, PVA and a bit of plaster, mixed it together so it was still a very liquid consistency, then took some thick kitchen towel and used it as a kind of paper mache, layering it up over the different sections I wanted to be earth, which gives it a nice kind of organic smoothness to it, and blends together any of the weird angles. With that layer dried, I moved on to regular sculptor mold and filled in the gaps. So not using this over the entire thing, but using it in the areas that need a bit more attention and will have a bit more texture to them. So blending out any of the creases, as well as filling in any of the gaps that have appeared. I also needed a way to get material into the top of the furnace, so I took a coffee stirrer and started pushing the sculptor mod around so I could get some earthen steps in. Then on the base I did a bit of a pavement thing around the edge of the building, just adding a few styrofoam flagstones to give a bit more of a transition between the wall and the ground. Then to fill in the gaps in the stonework, took some more sculptor mold, watered it down, and used a brush to apply it so it would only go into the cracks and leave the stone texture on the brickwork. To create the steps that would go up the back of the piece, I took coffee stirrers and some matte Mod Podge, then took some tiny blocks of balsa wood and glued one on each end. These I could then glue up the back of the piece to create a walkway. I mixed up a batch of my regular texture paste using fine sand, cork flock and PVA glue, along with a dollop of black gesso with a tiny splash of water. Then mixing this together till it's all the same colour. Taking a sculpting tool, I then started applying the texture paste around the steps, putting it on the inside and blending the edges into the hill. With the paste still drying, I took the opportunity to push a few posts in so I could add a banister rail later. And once that had dried, I mixed up another batch, using less cork flock this time, and no water, so it has a different texture and consistency, slightly stickier, so on the areas where it's steep around the sides, it gets more of a good hold on it. This step does remind me a fair bit of icing a cake as well. Then while this lower layer is still drying, pushing a few styrofoam rocks and a few small aquarium pebbles in as well. With that all primed up, I moved on to the painting stage and began with a base coat of burnt umber. The brickwork then got a coat of white paint, aiming only for the top portions of the stone. Then taking a large brush and some tan paint, I gave a heavy dry brush to the texture paste. This will emphasise the texture of the paste and start looking a bit like the end product. If you go too heavy in some sections, don't worry, you can always cover it up with static grass or tufts later, or hit it with a dark wash, or keep dry brushing and blend it together. With the base earth texture and painting done, I decided the tower wasn't quite big enough, so I started adding bits on top of the blast furnace, adding an extra layer of stones into a vague pyramid shape. Taking an old brush, I started applying matte Mod Podge in sections around the top, using a kind of stippling motion so the glue isn't put on uniformly, and gives a nice bit of variety to the static grass. Which then, taking the static grass applicator, don't taser yourself, applying a nice layer of that, and going around the build in sections, applying more and more static grass until I was happy with the end result. It's a good idea to always do static grass in areas and sections, as you can always add more, but you can't really take it off when it's down. Also putting a piece of paper down or something like that so you can catch the excess and reuse it. For a few extra details, I took some more coffee stirrers, trimmed them down into planks, as well as some balsa wood chunks, which I used for raw wood, to be thrown into the furnace later, and put a pile of that at the top, as well as applying the banister railings and some spare timbers and stone around the base of the furnace. To apply a little bit of weathering to these, I took a watered down black paint and applied a layer over the top. Where you have fresh beams, you do want them to be slightly lighter than old, aged wood, but you just want to blend them slightly so they look like they've been outside for a few days. Then taking a bunch of tufts of different colours and shapes, started applying them all over the piece, so you get a nice juxtaposition of industry and nature. I felt like the piece was still missing something at this point, so I made a quick lean-to out of coffee stirrers and balsa wood. Then glued this in place onto the furnace. And again, I don't know if having wood built onto a furnace is a good idea or not. Feels like it would be a risky idea, but the people who made the forge clearly don't have good health and safety either. Taking a square of EVA foam and a piece of sprue, I created a door handle, ready to be primed and painted. I also noticed at this point the base was slightly warped, and figured it would be a good idea to share an anti-warping trick with everyone. So if we flip the build upside down and take some PVA glue, you can spread PVA on the bottom in a star shape, and it will warp the base back into its original flat position. And the general rule for this is whatever you put on the bottom has to be the same thing that you put on top. So given the texture paste used PVA as the main bonding component, that will be enough to bend it back into the right shape. And with that interlude over, I attached the door handle. Taking my leaf hole puncher from Green Stuff World, I then took some old paper that I'd dyed, and created a bunch of tiny leaves to place all over the build as well. I like using orange leaves for this because that's normally the colour that dead leaves are, and gives a nice contrast to the greeny grey colours that are already on there. I use matte Mod Podge to attach the leaves, and place them around just to give a bit more interest and blend it into the other pieces I've created. Also a great time to cover up any holes that are still in the piece, or any weird little areas that need fixing. With those leaves dried, the piece was done. A kind of industrial hobbit hole, or as I'll be using it, a kind of rabbit warren from an industrial species of big rabbit people. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.